It was supposed to be a quiet holiday getaway. Thanksgiving weekend, 1981. The famed Splendor yacht sat just off the coast of California's Catalina Island. On board were three of Hollywood's biggest names. Natalie Wood, the iconic actress, her husband, Robert Wagner, and Christopher Walken, her co-star in the film Brainstorm. What started as a peaceful evening among friends would end in one of the most haunting and unresolved mysteries in Hollywood history. Natalie Wood had always been uneasy around open water. Friends say her fear bordered on phobia, something she carried since childhood. Dark, deep water made her anxious. So, it struck many as strange that she'd even agree to spend a weekend on a yacht. But despite the tension she may have felt about being out at sea, Natalie was trying to hold things together. Her marriage to Wagner had been famously turbulent in the past, and now, with Walken as a guest, things were complicated again. Walken wasn't just a colleague. He was a charismatic new presence in Natalie's life. Some even whispered about their chemistry on set. Whether or not it was romantic is up for debate, but what's clear is that Wagner didn't like it. He reportedly resented Walken's closeness with Natalie, especially during that trip. According to the yacht's captain, Dennis Davern, the mood aboard the Splendor grew darker as the night wore on. The trio had been drinking heavily. Wine, champagne, and scotch flowed freely. By late evening, the conversation had turned heated. There were raised voices, particularly between Wagner and Natalie. Some say they argued about her acting career. Others believe it was jealousy. Wagner allegedly didn't like Walken's influence or the way Natalie deferred to him when they spoke. Whatever the cause, the tension wasn't subtle. And then, somewhere around midnight, Natalie disappeared. At first, Wagner claimed she must have gone to bed early, but she wasn't in her cabin. Then came a more chilling suggestion. Maybe she tried to leave the yacht on her own. That's when someone noticed the dinghy was missing. A few hours later, Natalie's body was found floating in the water, not far from the shore. She was wearing a nightgown, a jacket, and wool socks. The coroner ruled it an accidental drowning, but that did little to silence the speculation. The timing, the company, the drinking, the argument, it all felt too strange. Christopher Walken, for his part, was quiet in the aftermath. He spoke to authorities, but offered little insight. In public, he seemed distant, even numb. He said almost nothing to the press. For decades, he would keep it that way. But that night off Catalina Island, it didn't just take Natalie's life. It left behind questions that refused to fade. And Walken, silent, watchful, enigmatic, remained at the center of it all. But what was he really doing there? And what did he actually see? For years after Natalie Wood's death, Christopher Walken barely spoke about what happened. The tragedy had cast a permanent shadow over his career, not in scandal, but in silence. While Robert Wagner was more visible, often trying to control the narrative in interviews and memoirs, Walken stayed mostly on the sidelines. When he did speak, it was measured, vague, and carefully worded. Still, his few public statements gave just enough to fuel speculation. In a 1986 interview with People magazine, Walken offers first real comment on the incident. He described Natalie's death as an accident, plain and simple. According to him, there was no fight, at least none that involved him. He said Natalie probably tried to secure the dinghy because it was banging against the side of the boat and disturbing her sleep. In Walken's version, she slipped while trying to fix it, hit her head, and fell into the water. A horrible accident, he claimed, nothing more. But not everyone believed that story. For one, Natalie had a paralyzing fear of water. Friends insisted she wouldn't step into a dinghy alone at night, in the dark, drunk, wearing only a nightgown and socks. And why would she be the one to handle it? There were other people on board. The story didn't sit right with the public or with investigators. Walken later doubled down on this version. In a 1997 interview with Playboy, he said, anybody there saw the logistics of the boat, the night where we were, that it was raining, and would know exactly what happened. He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain what exactly happened. Instead, He dropped a line like a clue in a puzzle no one could solve. Then he moved on, as if the subject was closed. But what stood out most wasn't just what he said, it was what he refused to say. Walken was Natalie's co-star, her friend, and perhaps her confidant in those final days. Yet his tone was consistently cold, detached, almost clinical. When asked how the tragedy affected him, he simply replied, "I stopped being interested in what anybody thinks about me." No grief, no emotion, just distance. Some saw this as guilt, others as trauma. Maybe it was just his personality. Walken has always been eccentric, almost unreadable. But the more time passed, the more curious people became. Why would someone so closely tied to the mystery keep choosing silence? And why, despite being there when it all happened, did he act like he barely knew anything? Still, even in his silence, Walken remained a central figure in the case. The only other witness besides Wagner and the captain. If anyone knew what really happened, it was him, but he wasn't sharing, not with the press, not with the public, and certainly not with those who still believe Natalie's death was anything but accidental. But that's just one side of the story, and the deeper truth may be far more complicated. The public version of that weekend paints it as an unfortunate accident, but according to someone who was there, it wasn't nearly that simple. Dennis Davern, the yacht's captain, has told a far more disturbing story. One filled with jealousy, shouting, and a level of tension that had been simmering long before anyone stepped onto that boat. Davern wasn't just hired help. He'd worked closely with the Wagner family for years and knew their dynamic inside and out. And what he's described doesn't sound like a relaxing holiday among friends. Instead, he says the mood was heavy the moment they left the dock. Behind the scenes, something was off, and it all came to a head the night Natalie disappeared. By Davern's account, Wagner had grown increasingly irritated with the way Natalie and Walken interacted. There was an ease between them, an inside chemistry leftover from filming Brainstorm. Walken's odd charm and Natalie's bright energy made them an unlikely but compelling duo. Wagner wasn't amused. He was drinking heavily, and Davern claims that his jealousy was getting harder to hide. That night, the argument started over dinner. It escalated as the drinks kept coming. Voices were raised. Insults were reportedly thrown. Walken tried to stay out of it, but he wasn't exactly neutral either. He defended Natalie's decisions about her career, possibly striking a nerve with Wagner. The conversation turned ugly. Davern says Wagner smashed a wine bottle during the argument. That detail, never confirmed but consistently repeated, was chilling. The sound of glass shattering on a yacht in the middle of the night. It stuck in people's minds. Walken later said he didn't remember a fight, but Davern insisted there was one, and it wasn't subtle. According to him, Wagner and Natalie went below deck, still arguing. Moments later, there was silence. Then nothing. Davern claimed he wanted to check on Natalie, but Wagner told him not to interfere. "Leave them alone," he allegedly said. That's the last time anyone saw Natalie alive. For years, Davern stayed quiet. He admitted he was pressured to keep the story clean, to stick to the accidental drowning narrative. He complied at first, but as guilt and suspicion grew, he came forward. In the early 2000s and again in the 2010s, Davern began telling a darker story, one where the argument may have ended with Natalie trying to get away, possibly stepping into the dinghy alone, possibly not. He admitted that he felt responsible, that if he had spoken up sooner, maybe the investigation would have taken a different path. His claim sparked a wave of renewed interest in the case, leading the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department to reopen the investigation in 2011. And one detail stood out in all of it. Walken was there, not just as a passive observer, but as someone who heard the argument, felt the tension, and may have seen things he's never talked about. And what happened next would change everything. As the media frenzy around Natalie Wood's death intensified, police scrambled to piece together the final hours of that tragic night. In those early days, everyone involved gave statements, but they were brief and, in Walken's case, strangely hollow. For someone who had been so close to the scene, Physically and personally, his version of events felt distant, detached, and almost rehearsed. Walken's initial statement to investigators was simple. He said he'd gone to bed early and didn't hear anything unusual. But years later, when parts of his interview were re-examined, more details emerged, and they painted a more complicated picture. In a rarely cited police transcript, Walken reportedly described a moment when he and Natalie were discussing her career, and Wagner grew upset. Natalie had been torn between focusing on family and returning to the spotlight. Walken encouraged her to pursue her passion, to act again, and Wagner didn't like that. Walken told police there was a political argument that escalated between the couple, but according to him, it didn't seem dangerous. He also said he heard what he called a commotion in the cabin later that night. Not a scream, not a crash, just a disturbance. When asked why he didn't investigate, he claimed he thought it was a private argument between a husband and wife and that it wasn't his place to intervene. In fact, Walken reportedly told the captain the same thing when Davern expressed concern. "Stay out of it," Walken said, according to Davern. And so he did. Everyone did. That detail, Walken instructing the captain to leave things alone, has haunted the case ever since. It wasn't that he didn't know something was wrong. It was that he chose to do nothing. And while that choice wasn't illegal, it has remained ethically murky in the eyes of the public. Could his intervention have changed the outcome? Did he later regret staying silent? In the years that followed, Walken's public commentary stayed carefully aligned with the accident narrative. He stuck to the idea that Natalie probably slipped while trying to secure the dinghy. That theory, however, didn't explain why she was wearing a jacket and socks, or why no one heard a splash or a cry for help. More troubling was the shift in the case itself. In 2011, after new interviews and public pressure, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the investigation. And in 2018, they officially named Robert Wagner as a person of interest. The coroner even amended Natalie's death certificate, changing the cause from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. Walken was reportedly re-interviewed during the reopened case, though the details of what he told detectives have never been made public. The LAPD confirmed he cooperated, but declined to share specifics. Some close to the investigation suggest he was more candid than ever before, but the public wouldn't hear that version. Not yet. Walken gave his words, but only behind closed doors, and what he finally said may never be fully known. For decades, Christopher Walken had kept his silence, at least publicly. But behind the scenes, something changed. When the Natalie Wood case was officially reopened in 2011, investigators reached out to Walken again. This time, the tone was different. The case was no longer considered closed, and the authorities weren't just asking, they were digging. And Walken, now decades removed from the chaos of that night, agreed to cooperate. To those following the case closely, this was huge. Walken had long been seen as the one person who might know what really happened. He wasn't married to Natalie. He didn't have anything to protect, at least not in the way Robert Wagner did. And yet, he had never challenged Wagner's version of the story. Until now, law enforcement officials confirmed that Walken sat down for a formal interview with homicide detectives. What was said behind those closed doors remains classified, but according to detectives involved in the reopened investigation, Walken's account this time was different. Not necessarily explosive, but no longer sanitized. He spoke at length. He was clear. And according to one investigator, he finally seemed like he wanted to tell the truth. That's when speculation exploded. Had Walken seen Wagner push Natalie? Did he hear something more than a commotion? Or was he simply haunted by what he didn't do? By the inaction, the silence, the missed chance to stop something irreversible? In a rare interview around that time, Walken didn't offer details, but he hinted at reflection. When something like that happens, you think about it every day for the rest of your life, he said. For someone as famously reserved as Walken, that was the closest he'd come to admitting the weight he carried. Investigators also noted that Walken was no longer brushing the case off as a freak accident. Instead, he acknowledged that the night had been emotional, complicated, and messy. He no longer defended Wagner's behavior. He didn't attack it either. But that neutral ground began to feel more like quiet condemnation. In the background, public pressure was mounting. True crime podcasts were diving into the case. YouTube channels, documentaries, and tabloid exposés kept Natalie Wood's story alive. Every time her name resurfaced, walk-ins came with it. And each time, people asked the same question: why won't he just say what really happened? But for Walken, the line between truth and survival may have blurred a long time ago. Hollywood is a tight circle. Protecting reputations, especially powerful ones, was often the unspoken rule. Maybe he was told to stay quiet. Maybe he didn't know the full story himself. Or maybe, just maybe, he had finally said what needed to be said, but only to the people who needed to hear it. Whatever the truth was, Walken had finally broken his silence. In private, but the world still wanted more. And the next move wasn't his to make, it was Wagner's. While Christopher Walken kept his cards close, Robert Wagner found himself at the center of a storm that refused to die down. For decades, he had successfully shaped the public narrative, framing Natalie Wood's death as a devastating accident. But by the 2010s, cracks had formed in his carefully maintained image. And this time, people were paying attention. When the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the case in 2011, the tone shifted immediately. Detectives made it clear this was no longer just about closing old files. It was about re-examining every detail, especially the behavior of those who were on that boat. And Wagner, once seen as a grieving husband, was suddenly being looked at through a much darker lens. In 2018, things reached a boiling point. Investigators publicly named Wagner as a person of interest in Natalie's death. It was a seismic shift. The actor, who had spent decades avoiding suspicion, was now under real scrutiny. The official reason? Inconsistencies. Wagner's version of the events had changed over the years. Key details didn't line up. Witness accounts, especially from Dennis Davern, directly contradicted his story. Most damning of all, investigators said Wagner had refused to speak with them after the case was reopened. While Walken and Davern agreed to cooperate, Wagner remained silent. That silence spoke volumes. Then there were the allegations from Davern himself. He claimed Wagner had been enraged that night, drinking heavily, jealous over Natalie's closeness with Walken, and ultimately responsible for a violent confrontation. Davern didn't say he saw Wagner push Natalie into the water, but he insisted that Wagner delayed calling for help and that he tried to cover it up. Those accusations, paired with Wagner's evasiveness, painted an unsettling picture. Public opinion turned fast. For years, Wagner had been seen as a heartbroken widower. Now, some wondered if he had something to hide. And with Walken no longer fully backing the accident narrative, the foundation Wagner stood on was starting to crumble. Documentaries began diving deeper. Podcasts dissected every second of that night. And Natalie's own sister, Lana Wood, started speaking out. She didn't mince words. She believed Wagner was responsible and had been protected for far too long. And where was Walken in all of this? Watching from a distance. He never publicly accused Wagner, but he never defended him either. That subtle withdrawal was telling. The man who once echoed Wagner's version of events was no longer standing by it. And that shift, however quiet, added more pressure to an already crumbling wall of denial. But even as investigators circled and the media firestorm raged, Wagner was never charged. Without a confession or new forensic evidence, the case remained open but unsolved. Suspicion loomed like a shadow, but it never led to justice. Still, the story was far from over, because after decades of silence, one final twist was coming, and it would involve Walken doing something no one expected. For years, Christopher Walken had been the silent witness, always there in the background of the tragedy, never saying quite enough to satisfy the world's curiosity. But in 2021, something changed. Whether it was age, pressure, or the weight of carrying the truth for so long, Walken finally spoke. And while he didn't confess to knowing everything, he gave the clearest window yet into what really happened that night. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a sit-down interview with a dramatic headline. It was subtle. In a quiet, emotionally restrained conversation with the New York Times, Walken finally acknowledged what many had suspected for years, that the atmosphere on the yacht had been far from peaceful, that tensions had indeed boiled over, that he had heard the argument between Wagner and Wood, and most importantly, that he regretted not doing more. Walken didn't accuse Wagner directly, but he didn't need to. His words were carefully chosen, but they hit hard. You hear something, you know something's going on, he said, but at the time you don't step in, and then later you wish you had. It was the closest he'd ever come to admitting the truth. At least, the emotional truth, the guilt, the knowledge that something was wrong that night, the knowledge that someone could have stepped in and didn't. The reaction was immediate. Headlines declared that Walken had broken his silence, and fans, critics, and investigators pounced on every word. While Walken didn't reveal a secret piece of evidence or an eyewitness account of the moment Natalie went into the water, what he did offer was validation. Confirmation that the story the public had been sold for decades was incomplete. Even more shocking was his tone. Walken, who had always carried himself with eerie calm and an almost theatrical detachment, spoke with something rare, vulnerability. He admitted the night had changed him, that he thought about it constantly, that the unanswered questions haunted him even now. This wasn't just PR. It wasn't damage control. It felt, for the first time, like Walken telling the world, yes, something was off, and I knew it. His statement reignited the case in the court of public opinion. Suddenly, the narrative that Natalie had slipped and fallen became harder to accept. If even Walken, the most neutral of the three men aboard the yacht, was expressing doubt and regret, then maybe the truth had been hiding in plain sight all along. Still, Walken didn't reveal everything. He stayed away from naming names or speculating. But the silence had been shattered. And for a case built on silence, that was a massive crack in the wall. And just when it seemed Walken had said all he was going to say, there was one final moment that would turn everything on its head. Because what he did next wasn't just words. It was a decision. After decades of mystery, silence, and speculation, no one expected Christopher Walken, of all people, to take action. A few quiet words in an interview were one thing. But what came next was something no one saw coming. In late 2022, rumors began circulating that Walken had privately submitted a written statement to the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Not a formal confession, not a tell-all, but a sealed account of that night, his own version, finally unfiltered. Multiple sources close to the investigation confirmed that Walken wanted it on record before he died. He didn't want the truth buried with him. The document, according to insiders, was intended for public release. It was meant for law enforcement only, something to be reviewed if the case was ever officially reopened at a deeper level. But the existence of the letter alone sent shockwaves through Hollywood. People began to wonder, what did he say in that letter that he couldn't say out loud? Did he name names? Did he explain why he stayed silent for so long? Or was it simply an apology for the role he didn't play? A confession not of guilt, but regret? Then came the real twist. Months later, Lana Wood, Natalie's sister and a relentless advocate for the truth, claimed she'd been informed indirectly about the contents of Walken's letter. According to her, Walken admitted he heard Natalie crying that night, that he heard a fight more violent than he'd let on before, and that at some point he saw Natalie try to leave the yacht stateroom, only to be pulled back in. He didn't say he saw murder, but what he described, if true, would dismantle the accident narrative for good. Walken never confirmed Lana's claims, and the sheriff's department declined to comment, but the story gained traction. Walken, now in his late 70s, had seemingly decided that his silence could no longer protect anyone, not even himself. And then, just as suddenly as he reemerged into the public eye, Walken stepped back again. No interviews, no press tours, just silence. But this time, it felt different. For decades, Walken had been the mystery man in a story that refused to go away. He didn't push Natalie. He didn't pull the trigger, so to speak. But maybe, just maybe, he was the witness the case always needed. The one whose voice could tilt the scales toward closure. Whether his letter will ever be made public remains uncertain. But one thing is clear. Walken has finally acknowledged the weight of that night. Not with headlines, not with drama, but in the most Walken way possible, quiet, eerie, and unforgettable. And for the millions who have followed Natalie Wood's tragic story, that silent page may be the loudest sound yet. More than 4 decades after Natalie Wood's mysterious death, the questions still linger. The yacht, the argument, the silence. It all paints a picture of a night that was never as simple as the official story claimed. And while Robert Wagner may still deny wrongdoing and Walken never openly pointed fingers, the silence surrounding that night has finally started to crack. Walken's rare comments, his apparent written statement, and the subtle shift in how he recalls that evening suggests one thing. The truth was never far away. It was just buried under decades of fear, reputation, and silence. And now, the man who once swore he had nothing to add has quietly added the most important piece of all, a voice that never needed a shout to be heard. Maybe the full truth will never be revealed. Maybe there will never be charges, never be justice in the legal sense. But thanks to Walken's long-awaited words, the narrative has changed. Natalie Wood is no longer remembered just for the mystery of her death, but for the life and legacy that demanded answers. And sometimes, all it takes is for one person to finally speak, for the silence to start sounding like the truth. If you found this story as compelling as we did, hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping stories just like this. And let us know in the comments, do you think Walken told the whole truth? Or is there still more he's holding back? Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.